favorite pieces of text is a very short piece by James Joyce, published in this book called Dubliners. And it's really a kind of two-page, 2.5-page text, which is called Death of a Lady at Sydney Parade. And I'm not going to read the whole 2.5 pages, but I'll read you a few of the lines just to give you something of the kind of tone of this story. Death of a Lady at Sydney Parade, a painful case. Today at the City of Dublin Hospital, the Deputy Coroner, in the absence of Mr. Leverett, held an inquest on the body of Mrs. Emily Sinico, aged 43 years, who was killed at Sydney Parade Station yesterday evening. The evidence showed that the deceased lady, while attempting to cross the line, was knocked down by the engine of the 10 o'clock slow train from Kingstown, thereby sustaining injuries of the head and right side, which led to her death. James Lennon, driver of the engine, stated that he had been in the employment of the railway company for 15 years. On hearing the guard's whistle, he set the train in motion, and a second or two afterwards brought it to rest in response to loud cries. The train was going slowly. P. Dunn, railway porter, stated that as the train was about to start, he observed a woman attempting to cross the lines. He ran towards her and shouted, but before he could reach her, she was caught by the buffer of the engine and fell to the ground. A juror: you saw the lady fall? Witness: yes. And the story goes on. While this is, of course, the inquest and takes place only on one location, the thing that's important about it is that this particular event of the accident, the lady being run over by the engine of the train, actually is represented in these 2.5 pages through a multiplicity of representations, from the porter's point of view, from the doctor at the hospital, and so on and so forth. And this singular event has, in a sense, a kind of multiplicity of representations. Each of the event is somehow also presented in terms of the point of view of the person who's dealing with it. The doctor's version of the accident is obviously very different from that of the witness, from that of the porter, and so on and so forth. And it seems to me that this has very close analogies with what we do in architecture. Somehow, when we think about architecture, we make drawings, we make specifications, we talk to the client, we tell the story of the building to the contractor, and all these multiplicities of representations are the things that really constitute the project. There is no singular representation of the project that somehow represents its coherence, its essence, but it's these multiplicities. One of the things that has happened at the AA over the last few years, primarily through the work of Pascal and Ingrid, but also I think a number of other people, has been this interest in film. And I think that it's very clear that this relationship between architecture and film could also be said to be one of these representations, one of these dimensions of the architectural project. Now I want to take you to another short text, which is from the book The Logic of Images by Wim Wenders. And the very first piece at the beginning of this book is Wim Wenders replying to a questionnaire which says, "Why do you make films?" And this for him is a very hard question. And he says, "Ever since this terrible question was put to me, I've done nothing but think of how to answer it. I have one answer in the morning and one at night, one at the editing table, one when I'm looking at stills of earlier films of mine, another when I'm speaking to my accountant, and yet another when I think of the team I've been working with for years now. Every one of these different answers, these reasons for making films, is sincere and genuine. But I keep saying to myself, there must be something more fundamental, some commitment or even a compulsion. I was 12 years old when I made my first film with an 8mm camera. I stood by a window and filmed the street below, the cars and pedestrians. My father saw me and asked, "What are you doing with your camera?" And I said, "Can't you see? I'm filming the street." "What for?" he asked. I had no answer. 10 or 12 years later, I was making my first short film in 16 millimeters. A reel of film lasted 3 minutes. I filmed the crossroads from the 6th floor without moving the camera until the reel was finished. It didn't occur to me to pull away or to stop shooting any earlier. With hindsight, I suppose it would have seemed like sacrilege to me. Why sacrilege? I'm no great theorist. I tend not to remember things I've read in books, so I can't give you Bela Balash's exact words, but they affected me profoundly all the same. He talks about the ability and the responsibility of cinema to show things as they are. And he says cinema can rescue the existence of things. That's precisely it. I have another quote from Cézanne where he says, "Things are disappearing. If you want to see anything, you have to hurry." So back to the awful question, why do I make films? Well, because something happens, you see it happening, you film it as it happens, the camera sees it and records it, and you can look at it again afterwards. The thing itself may no longer be there, but you can still see it. The fact of its existence hasn't been lost. The act of filming is a heroic act, not always, not often, but sometimes. For a moment, the gradual destruction of the world of appearances is held up. The camera is a weapon against the tragedy of things, against their disappearing. Why make films? Bloody stupid question. Now, it seems that maybe to talk about the relationship between architecture and cinema is also, in the words of Wim Wenders, a kind of bloody stupid question, if we are to take the title of the conference, Cinematecture and Architectography, for granted. But it seems that we're not taking that for granted either. At least that is what is going to be discussed today in terms of this relationship. The title of the conference, Cinematecture and Architectography, already, in a sense, on one level, assumes that there is the possibility for a kind of chiasmatic union of a kind of what Hayden White would call a kind of diatactical relationship between cinema and architecture, cinematecture and architectography. But in a sense, what is, I think, also very important is for us to discuss the limits of this relationship. What are the limits of the relationship between architecture and film? Maybe we can see that some of the best pieces of architecture have been done by people who have been experts in architectography, or some of the best films have been made by people who have been incredible people in the field of cinematecture. But anyway, that is, I think, something to be discussed. One of the people that I think has given us certain kind of clue about this relationship, and I think he's going to probably feature dominantly in terms of the discussion today, is the work of Gilles Deleuze. And his primary focus in terms of the connection between, or the role of movement and time, and the way in which these two topics of movement and time have a very specific impact in the field of architecture. Recently, John Rachman has touched on this issue in his book Constructions, very briefly, really, a few sentences in regard to the question of abstraction. But what is important is that he points out that really the work of Deleuze in this field is quite different from that, for example, of Christian Metz and the idea of semiology of film, that it doesn't try to get rid of narrative and emphasize the self-referential aspect of architecture, but he says one must put this sort of abstraction first, see it as first, and to take narration as only an indirect consequence that flows from movement and time, rather than the other way around. I think in architecture there's a tendency to do it very often the other way around, to actually, in a sense, to prioritize narration, to prioritize the storyline, rather than to prioritize somehow this connection between movement and time, and then see the kind of narrativity that comes from it. For film, Rachman says, is not a code of which abstraction would be self-reference. It is an abstract machine that has movement and time as specific abstract virtualities, which then get effectuated in particular social and political conditions. Narrative is only one restricted possibility of film. Thus, what Deleuze counts as most specific to film, the forces of its time and movement images, is at the same time what opens original connections with other mediums, for example, with architecture, which Deleuze then sees as closer to film than is theater. I think another aspect of this connection between architecture and film is something that I think has been in some ways explored by the unit. And I would like to now conclude by reading a very brief piece from Gabriel Marcel from the 1950s, where Krakauer, in his theory of film, uses this short piece to really talk about the emphasis of film as a kind of element of reminder for us. Marcel, he attributes to film, especially documentary film, the power of deepening and rendering more intimate our relation to this earth, which is our habitat. And I should say, he adds, that to me, who has always had a propensity to get tired of what I have the habit of seeing, what is reality, that is, I do not see anymore, this power peculiar to the film seems to be literally redeeming. In a sense, this power of the film is as much about memory as it is about memorization, as it is about the act of not forgetting, for us to be reminded of the things that seem the most ordinary every day. So with that, I would like to thank Pascal Schöning for organizing this conference, for all the participants for their presentations, and for all of you for coming today. Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohsen. Before I begin, I would like to say that I thank our chairman, Mohsen Mostafavi, very much, and Mark Cousins, our director of General Studies, that this conference was made possible. I think it's very seldom, and from my teaching experience, pretty much all over the world, I can say this is possibly the only school where that is possible in this way. This is as well the whole field, because I'm allowed to run a unit which deals with these questions, which is, again, unique in the world, that is possible. So thank you, Mohsen. Thank you, Mark. I think I scrap my speech I wanted to give because Mohsen formulated it already, and I only would, in a way, repeat a little bit different, but I want to show one thing. This is architecture. And what normally happens with that is that possibly water flows through it, or air, or what. But the problem of defining space and time simultaneously is the biggest problem, unsolved problem, in physics and in philosophy as well. So recently, German scientists, I'm sorry they were German, but it was approved by the Americans, were able to accelerate speed higher than the speed of light. which was unthinkable before. So, and why I have this tube is because it was done with an instrument which basically looked like this piece of pipe. So what they did is they transported music of Mozart by light, waves, and otherwise by accelerated microwaves through a tube. And the interesting thing about that is that one could register the outcome of the music earlier than the income. That means something about our thinking when we design architecture, because that normally has a pretty logic row of causality and result. So in the last decades, more or less, really, I would say since Bergson's Matter and Memory, the thinking is different. Coming to film now, if you think of that with that speed acceleration, the measurement, the outcome was earlier than the income. Imagine a Hitchcock film. Would you think in a Hitchcock film the protagonist enters the building first or comes out of the building first? And think about that, what that means. Thank you. Mark Cousins, please, our Director of General Studies, philosopher and psychologist or psychotherapist, will give the first lecture. Thank you.
Okay. I hope that what I have to say has a bearing, even if an indirect bearing, on discussions about relationship between architecture and cinema. I say indirectly because what it's really concerned with is a certain type of space, a problem which is common to kind of both media. And what I want to try and suggest, or rather the implications of what I want to argue, is that the way in which current discussions are frequently structured in terms of an idea that somehow the image is coming to dominate, especially dominate space and dominate structure. Perhaps even that architecture itself is being overtaken by the image. Really, my argument is a plea for kind of rejecting that and actually suggesting that in some sense one of the problems is that we study the image solely through the register of visuality. And there may be good grounds actually for studying the image on a different basis, for studying the image in a way related to bodily space and the forms of projection which are projected from the body. Now, in order to try to make this point, I'm going to give a sort of brief, shortened version of a longer analysis of Hitchcock's film Vertigo. And in order that I can sort of condense the argument, I've divided it into different sections. In what I'll try to do in the first part of the analysis is to give what I take to be, would be a classical psychoanalytic interpretation of the major elements of the film, and then try to interpret it again to imply not exactly that the first one was wrong, but that it was certainly inadequate to certain contemporary realities and certain contemporary tasks. So I'll try then to give a second interpretation which concentrates on the role of images. And then I'll try and say something about the kind of topography of those images, images which I think are not best studied through the question of visuality or scopophilia or the scopic drive, all the kinds of concepts which in a sense have had such a good run for their money in the last 3 decades. I'm not exactly posing myself against those, but I am suggesting that perhaps it's time that we turned to another way of studying images, which for sort of manifesto purposes I'll call the imago, and try to say something about the topography of the imago, much of which the theoretical work has been done, but done in a very different context. The context, actually, I think, is the early Christian reaction to images and the problems of images in kind of early Christian theology. And I mean quite seriously that I think there we have an enormous resource to reopen the question of images as a type of affective space. So, without more ado, I'll turn to the question of the movie Vertigo. Or rather, I'll say 2 more things before I do. It's noted in clinical practice, in psychoanalysis, that things aren't as easy as they either used to be or ought to be. In particular, classical analysis thought that it had neurosis beat. In a sense, it thought that once you understood the structure of a neurosis, once, as it were, the patient began, through your interpretation, to develop insight into the symptom, once, as it were, the patient began not just to see intellectually, but began to see emotionally what the symptom was a compromise between 2 conflicting forces. Once the patient began to develop a tolerance to withstand those conflicting forces in and of themselves, then in a sense the symptom would vanish because the symptom was no longer needed. Now, that in a sense, in a very brief classical description of a neurosis and of the therapeutic intervention which would be made against it. Now, indeed, psychoanalysis had a great success in this field. But even by the end of the 30s, and I think really a mounting feeling in the decades since the war, there's a feeling that there's a sort of troubling bit left over, that there is something resistant to the interpretation of neurosis, perhaps even resistant to interpretation itself. And this residue is variously theorized. For some, for example, it'll be thought of as a sort of pre-Oedipal stain that simply lasts in the character forever and must be approached in a pre-Oedipal fashion. For others, they detect that underneath the neurotic symptom there is a kind of layer of traumatization. And indeed, the notion of trauma, it now seems to me, is sort of pandemic, both in the human sciences, but as a sort of popular object. Everybody in America seems either to have been traumatized or on the verge of claiming that they have been. And it's that kind of layer, that issue of resistance, which I'm going to call the layer of images, or the layer of the imago. And as I say, I will try to kind of point up this difference. The first part of my analysis, I will, as it were, pretend to be a classical, I will pretend to represent classical analytic interpretation, shall we say, in 1939, and then I will go over the film again to reinterpret it. So the first interpretation, the classical interpretation of vertigo, might go as follows. It would first of all look at the question of the fact that what seems to be in question is vertigo. Although even here the film alerts us very quickly that we can't simply use the word vertigo. The James Stewart character himself in the first scene refers to it as a form of agoraphobia. Nevertheless, what we seem to be dealing with in the film is a phobia. Now, the classical interpretation of a phobia would go something like this: that the phobic object, the thing which you're terrified of, be it heights or spiders or whatever, is in fact an object of desire, but it is an object of desire which is completely unacceptable. In that sense, the object of desire has to be repressed, and it returns to the subject no longer as a desire, but an absolute fear. Now you can see the elements of compromise here, of compromise formation in a traditional sense. On the one hand, the object is desired, but the desire is repressed, and therefore, in a way, a phobia enables you to stay away from the object as far as possible. Consciously, of course, the staying away from the object means that you're keeping the feared thing at bay, but what's also being kept at bay is your desire. So if the James Stewart character is suffering from vertigo, the analysis will have to follow a path which tries to identify what the object of desire is. Now, let's look at a representation, first of all, of his symptom of vertigo, because from it we can already learn certain kind of spatial aspects. Could we show the first clip? This is halfway through the film, where the person he appears to have fallen in love with, Madeleine, is racing up the tower. He knows that somehow she is in psychic danger. He has fallen in love with her, and here's what happens when they get into the tower. Okay? Sorry, we went all through this just before. Now this enables us to kind of begin to fill out some idea of the space, the vertiginous space, which is the object of phobia stroke desire. The first thing to say about it is that it is an enclosed space. It is the well of this staircase. And the second thing to bring to bear is this very brilliant and idiosyncratic shot that Hitchcock employs, where he both moves the camera away while also zooming in. So you get this kind of extraordinary effect of going backwards and forwards at the same time. There is here, a kind of suggestion of a movement which itself has to be thought of as part of the space, and that movement has to be itself part of the definition of the phobia stroke desire. It is then the fear of a certain type of enclosed space within which there is movement. Okay. Can we have the second? Sorry, could you just stop it a moment? This scene is when, earlier on in the film, for the first time, he's following Madeleine. She goes into a gallery, whereas you'll see she enacts an identification with Carlotta Valdez, the subject of the portrait. And it is here that Hitchcock's at his most kind of structuralist, sort of pedagogic structuralist mode. You'll see that he's determined to kind of teach you the relationship between the bouquet of flowers and the something else that we'll come to talk about. Okay, can we play it? Okay. Now, this is the first time that we have, as it were, the revelation, first of all, of the identification of Madeleine with Carlotta Valdez, but, as it were, a series of other kind of parallelisms. The parallelism is drawn by Hitchcock between the bouquet of flowers, and for the first time we see the centrality of the coif of hair at the back. And it is, I'd like to suggest, the coif of hair, the space within the hair, which in fact is the object of desire, or the phobic object. I mean, for the most part, the phobic object is the space like a tower, but as it were, its parallel in desire is the coif of hair. And we'll see two clips now which thoroughly kind of underline this, although the film is really a dense net of these cross-references between the two spaces. Okay, so can we show the next?
You're taken home that way.
No, you're right. I'm glad you didn't take me home. I wouldn't have known you. Thank you. But I don't know you, and you don't know me. My name is Madeleine Astor.
My name's John Ferguson.
Good, strong name. Your friends call you John or Jack?
Oh, John, mostly. Old friends call me John. Acquaintances call me Scotty.
I shall call you Mr. Ferguson.
Oh, gee whiz, I wouldn't like that. Oh, no. And after what happened this afternoon, I should think maybe you'd call me Scotty. Maybe even John.
Okay, can we cut that? This is the scene where he's fished her out of the bay, and as it were, central to their introduction is the fact that she is putting up her hair and putting it into that coif and kind of restoring it. Can we go on to the next scene? Well, in a moment. Sorry, hang on a second. This is a scene from towards the end of the film in which Madeleine, having appeared to die, actually reappears in the second half, but he doesn't realize it's the same woman. He thinks it's quite close to her. And he attempts in the second half of the film to mold the girl who comes from Kansas back into the image of Madeleine, although in fact, of course, it's one and the same person. She resists. There is here a kind of incredibly somber meditation, really, on the question of identity, because she is in the preposterous position of trying to resist becoming the image of the person she actually was in the first part, but which image she feels most alienated. She says in the second half, "Why can't you love me for myself?" By this stage in the film, quite what the question, "Why can't you love me for myself?" would mean is kind of anybody's guess. Even when he has remolded her in terms of the grey suit, even when he has had her hair dyed, even then at the last moment, she resists the final but crucial issue of putting her hair up in this form, and finally he has begged her to do so. This is where she goes into the bathroom, and the word return would be wrong here. What you'll notice is she does is rematerialize as an image. So can we just see this? Okay, there are a number of points to kind of make. The first really is about her status like as an image. You see her incarnate, that's the wrong word, the opposite of incarnated. She becomes more and more this image. What seems to be kind of very important is the way she materializes through the door, and also the use of this pale gaseous green lighting, which is characteristic in this film. The second thing is that as they kiss, Hitchcock really makes a kind of revolutionary new shot, or certainly a shot that's revolutionary in Hollywood, which is to say a 360-degree shot. Now, psychically, what ought to be happening by virtue of kissing her is that in some sense the kind of neurosis would sort of dislodge itself, a repression would be lifted, and he ought to be, in that 360-degree shot, having access to his own memories. What's very interesting about this film, very brilliant, is that what he's getting is access to her memories, or if not actually to her memories, certainly to her representation in the first half of her own memories. Now, I mean, I think I've had to sort of cut out a great deal, but we would be in a position, in terms of classical analysis, to move very straightforwardly, if rather clumsily, into an interpretation of the phobia. And it would be this, that the vertigo as a symptom represents an incestuous wish for the mother, an incestuous wish for the mother which has been repressed. The evidence for saying that is precisely the link between the space of the tower, the precise characteristics of the space of the tower, and the space of the maternal hair in that coif. Once one accepts the parallelism between them, then somehow the interpretation becomes almost kind of, well, actually it becomes inevitable, and that's one of the problems with it. So it would be entirely in line with classical interpretation to say that the key to interpreting the symptom of vertigo in the film is that it is the repressed wish for the mother. Now, that interpretation in itself would not be regarded as necessarily sufficient. There would have to be corroborating evidence for making that interpretation. And in terms of the film, the corroborating evidence is absolutely there. And it takes the form of his relation in the first half of the film with the character played by Barbara Bel Geddes. Now, Barbara Bel Geddes is intelligent, beautiful, and should be the woman he falls in love with and kind of marries. And indeed, I'm afraid every time I see the film, I still want to kind of shout out, you know, no, for heaven's sake, fall in love with her. And every time I watch it, it still doesn't happen. The reason why he can't fall in love with her, why he can't form a relation of love, is because, as it were, it's not that he has an incestuous wish for his mother, it's rather that it has been repressed. And therefore, it keeps intervening. The return of the repressed will mean that that desire has never been worked through, and therefore, in some senses, has never been psychically integrated. It's not a question of whether you do or don't have incestuous wishes, everybody does, but if they are repressed, in a curious way, they stay alive, albeit in the crypt of the unconscious, waiting to return. They are, as it were, present, to use a causality that Spinoza uses, they are present in their effects. Now, if we just very briefly look at three clips which surround the character of Midge. The first one is the discussion of the brassiere at the beginning of the film, which establishes absolutely his inability to establish a sexual relation. You'll hear it referred to at the end of this clip as a hobby. There's also, I think, here an architectural joke in the discussion of the brassiere. You have to imagine that James Stewart, architectural graduate of Princeton University, is talking to Barbara Bel Geddes, daughter of Norman Bel Geddes. And I think this throws some light on the discussion of what's called the cantilevering of the breasts. Okay, sorry, can we show?
What's this doohickey?
It's a brassiere. You know about those things. You're a big boy now.
I never run across one like that.
It's brand new. Revolutionary uplift. No shoulder straps and no back straps, but does everything a brassiere should do. Works on the principle of the cantilever bridge.
Does?
Mm-hmm. An aircraft engineer down the peninsula designed it. He worked it out in his spare time.
kind of a hobby. Do-it-yourself type thing.
Okay, now Midge herself, who obviously intuits the structure, the psychic structure of the James Stewart character, tries herself to make an intervention. And she does it by making an interpretation, and the interpretation is of great intelligence, because what she does is to intervene at the level of images in order to try to break the series of images which are organizing James Stewart. It's a brilliant interpretation she makes, but like many brilliant interpretations, it's vitiated by its bad timing. So let's show the next clip.
You, I always said you were wasting your time in the underwear department.
Well, it's a living. But I'm really excited about this.
What is it, still life?
No, not exactly. You want to see?
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, I thought I might give it to you.
Oh.
Johnny.
No, it's not funny, Mitch.
Johnny?
No.
Johnny, I just thought...
No. Let's make that movie some other night.
Johnny?
It's the rewards for being an intelligent woman in the 50s. The final one is where she has been to the hospital, where after the apparent death of Madeleine, he is sunk in Stygian melancholy, and she is trying to explain what's the matter with him to the doctor. There is also now, she also walks out of the film at this point, and it's a very unusual moment for Hitchcock, because you'll see that she actually is she's given a long departing shot, and it's one, I think, of extraordinary tenderness and humanity on the part of Hitchcock, because what she's doing is walking down a corridor. What she's in fact doing, in a somewhat tragic fashion, is to walk through precisely the space, which is the space of vertigo stroke desire, and for her, it is no problem. Okay.
Guilt complex. He blames himself for what happened to the woman. We know little of what went on before.
Well, I can give you one thing. He was in love with her.
Oh, that does complicate the problem, doesn't it?
And I can give you another complication. He still is. You want to know something, Doctor? I don't think Mozart's going to help at all.
Okay, now I think, as it were, if you take the two sides together, this would have been thought to constitute an adequate analysis. The part of Midge here shows in a very consistent way, consistent that is with the interpretation of the symptom, it shows in a consistent way his inability to form a relation precisely on the basis of his symptom. But if that's the classical interpretation, then it seems to me we're left with a kind of sense of dissatisfaction. We're left with a sense of dissatisfaction with an explanation which at one level kind of seems too neat, too reductive, and in a sense too referential. I mean, somehow, on the one hand, we seem to be able to employ a reasonably persuasive and powerful logic to say, aha, it was the mother, right? But the question is, what on earth have you said by saying it's the mother? Are we simply trying to kind of identify someone in a cast of characters? You know, what does the mother mean independently of the figure or the person of the mother? Now, at this point, you know, in 30 seconds, let's sketch out child development. Let's imagine that in the earliest life of the infant, there is simply a circuit of need and satisfaction. The baby, or rather, as Winnicott says, there's no such thing as a baby, there's only a mother and baby. It's like the presence of Francesca's making the action. There she is, having left the baby behind. And as it were, the mother is always there to meet the demand of the baby before the demand is even made. So, you know, this circuit, the point about this circuit is that at no point does it require representation. Now, let us imagine in a kind of just so story way that one day, one catastrophic day, the breast, or whatever the breast symbolizes, is not there. Now, Freud says on being confronted with the frustration of the object not being there, let us say the breast, the first thing the baby will do is to hallucinate a feed. Now, hallucinations are all very well, but one thing that hallucinations do not contain is milk. And so, in a way, the subject has already been, or the baby has already been catastrophically precipitated into a kind of realm of desire rather than demand on the one side, and representation as substitution on the other side. The hallucination is a representation of the feed. The demand for it's not satisfied, what's in play is desire. We might say at this point the human being sets off in a fictional direction. Now, that's the regime in which babies, infants, children, and ex-children have to kind of suffer until the grave. An economy of a desire which can never be met, where the object of desire is a representation as substitution for something else. Now, the question here is how we interpret the word substitution. The world which has been lost, the world of the bliss of demand and satisfaction, is one which in a sense is usually called the question of the lost object. Now, the lost object is not a thing. It's certainly not a breast. The lost object can't be found, except under the conditions of psychosis. The lost object can't be found. It is, as it were, simply the dimension of the economy of desire and representation. It's the thing that's always missing. The thing that's always missing which maintains the economy of desire and representation. Now, obviously, in the first interpretation of the film, you know, we're really saying a number of things are substitutes for each other, and the substitutes really refer back, and in a way refer back referentially to the mother. Now, I don't think that's kind of very helpful. It's not that I think it's wrong, but it's that it perhaps is much more productive to think of the analysis in terms of that what a substitute refers to is a previous substitute. Or in the film, what an image refers to is a previous image. So what we're dealing with is not some original object, but as it were, with a series of substitutions. Indeed, Another way of looking at the film is precisely to see it as an incredibly complex play of images, or rather the way in which the James Stewart character is actually played out through images. And I'd just like to take three clips, to sort of try and demonstrate that. Could we have like yeah. This is where he first sees her in the first half of the film. Okay, now there are a number of points which we can kind of develop from this. The first is, I mean, it's an extraordinarily kind of complex space with a large amount of kind of doubling and substitution even within the scene, even within the room, kind of through the mirrors. It is an extraordinary shot which leads to them because actually, especially in the second half of the shot, it's about at the height of a child rather than of an adult. There's a great importance attached to double images, which we'll see kind of repeated in a minute. And it's also an opportunity to note something very important about the play of visuality and the look in this film. One of the most extraordinary things is that if you look at the James Stewart character throughout the film, you almost only see like the whites of his eyes. I mean, given that it's a film about looking, it's extraordinary that what you're looking at almost is the image of a blind man. What he's actually doing, and obviously this is very deliberate by Hitchcock, is that he positions Stewart's head in such a way as if Stewart is to see something, it is only by kind of keeping his head still and by straining his eyes to the side so that he can steal a glimpse or catch a glimpse of what's going on. There's a whole kind of thematics of kind of blindness and guilt that attends this. This is the first time you see the restaurant, you see this. This is the moment, as it were, where this image of her, and indeed the restaurant, attaches itself to a previous series of images and is, which continues through the film. So if we could now see the next clip, which plays off on that one. Oh, sorry. Sorry, can we just stop this one? We'll come back. I'd like to show the gallery scene again, but now, as it were, not to look at the question of the equivalence of the bouquet and the coif of hair, but rather to follow it in terms of the looks that are there. Who's looking at whom, how. So if we could just go through this shot again, reinterpreting it in a different light. condition which animates him. Back to the restaurant and, as it were, play out the previous scene in the restaurant, but now, as it were, his wish to see her image is so great that he can't see that he's sitting next to her. He actually is captivated by the image of someone else who comes into the restaurant, who for a second or two belongs to the series of images in which the Kim Novak doesn't at the moment. So could we show that? This is her reincarnation as a girl from she is presumably meditating on the kind of singular fate that surrounds the circulation of her image around anywhere except where she is, the source of the image. Okay, could we cut now to the shop scene where you see repeated...
All right, we'll find it.
...of his wish for her to be made into the image.
Scotty, what are you doing?
I'm trying to buy you a suit.
But I love the second one she wore. And this one, it's beautiful.
No, they're none of them right.
Oh, I think I know the suit you mean. We had it some time ago. Let me go and see. We may still have that model.
Thank you.
You're looking for the suit that she wore for me. You want me to be dressed like her.
Judy, I just want you to look nice. I know the kind of a suit that'll look well on you.
No, I won't do it.
Judy, it can't make that much difference to you. I just want to see what
No, I don't want any clothes. I don't want anything. I want to get out of here.
Judy, do this for me.
Here we are.
Yes, that's it.
I thought so. I don't like it.
No, we'll take it.
Okay.
Will the thing fit?
Well, yes.
Now, we'll dispense with the other clip because time's getting on. I really want to kind of say that there's somewhat more kind of inchoate analysis of the second part. Is really to draw your attention to the fact that it is possible, in a sense, not to take the question of reference back to something like the mother, but to take it to say, yes, this is representation as substitution, the image, but to take it through the series to which it belongs. There is reference. The image does refer, but it doesn't refer to something. It refers to a previous image, and therefore belongs to the series. And there isn't an foundation to this series. If you like, you're welcome to call the starting point mother. It's an incredible number of things people call mother, but really that's all they're doing. It isn't, mother here is like a term, meaning perhaps like the first. It's not a term which is being used, as it were, as explanation. Ah, I see, it's the mother. So, as it were, what we're dealing with in the film is the way in which he's produced in and by images. The film at that level, I think, is an incredibly kind of somber, Augustinian kind of meditation on what Augustine would have called the tragedy and we would probably call the irony of identity and identification and its relation to the image. But I want to make the point that the analysis of the image here is not actually a kind of visual question. I'm not referring here to the scopic drive. I'm not referring to the imaginary. I'm not referring to that whole tradition in film studies, but also in art criticism, which deals with images as if images are always pictures. Right? And I want to try to enter in the strongest distinction between what we might call a picture and an image. In a way, if images belong to this kind of level of interpretation and analysis that the classic Oedipal interpretation doesn't quite reach, if the image here is referring to some sort of automatic process of the reproduction and the replaying out of what had gone before in the what goes after, if image refers to that, there is, in a sense, a way of calling that level, though it has complications, calling that level something of the level of the traumatic within the individual. Now, what is it to talk about a traumatic image? In a way, remember that the very term trauma, kind of etymologically, simply means wound. And what I'd suggest here, in a way, is that the images might be thought of as wounds. I mean, since the film is such a self-conscious film about these problems, it doesn't do much harm to refer to them narratively, although in fact what we're making are interpretative points. But we might say that the James Stewart character is produced out of the series of images, that those images, in a sense, are really a wound. They are what pierce him. And they're what, in a way, make it very little related to to the question of his visuality. He's not staring at things. He's not avoiding. There isn't all that sort of panoply of the Scopic drama going on. Indeed, for most of the film, he's blind. He can't even tell that he's with Jim Novak in the second half of the film. I mean, this is not a visually acute man. He is kind of blindness personified. Now, if you think about the image as a wound, it seems to me that we're putting the question of the image in a different kind of space than the image is normally placed. First of all, it's obviously placed in relation to the body. The wound's relation to the body is precisely that which cannot be said to be inside or outside. Perhaps we might think of the idea of an image as wound as perhaps almost being like a tattoo, or some way in which something is at the body. Now, if something is at the body, in this sense, there's no point trying to think that it obeys the sort of little Cartesian kind of drama. It certainly doesn't obey a kind of Albertian drama of vision. The idea of the picture as a window on the world with all the concomitant fantasies and perhaps architectural realities of inside and outside. The image as wound is precisely that which kind of disrupts the question of inside or outside, and which transforms, in a sense, the study of the image into, in effect, its affective relation. I mean, it's here in a way that I think we can take some clue from theology in its treatment of the image, insofar as precisely what theology was concerned is with the affective relations to the image, whether or not someone is guilty of idolatry. I mean, what is the affective economy of idolatry? Now, it seems to me that Freud moves partly towards this when he's concerned with the image as what he calls the imago. And what the imago is that thing within the image which you identify with as, in some sense, coming from before and governing you after. Now, it seems to me that's merely a kind of preliminary suggestion. I've in no way had time to articulate what it would mean to begin to transfer the question of the analysis of the image from its traditional kind of visual and semiotic status into, as it were, the space of the wound. In any case, I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark Cousins, for your epic essay on the representation of negative space. I think our schedule will be mixed up, and it's CAA, that means it never happens linear, but we are trying. So our next speaker is Dr. Christa Blümlinger